Okay, hi all. This is my very big pleasure to be again with Professor Baruch Fischhoff. Baruch, thank you so much for allocating the time to meet with me. Again, this is the follow-up talk to the DEB seminar on theory informed and theory informing, but not theory testing decision science. And if you have not watched it yet, I encourage you to watch it. And I will jump straight to the first question. Can you please summarize your talk to an undergrad student from an unrelated field?
Yes, well, thanks for having me, it was actually fun putting together that talk because I usually don't talk to psychologists. So this is a talk for psychologists, so I tried to make the case that there's some it can be very exciting for somebody who studies decision making to do that in the context of big projects that involve lots of people, which are take advantage of what we've learned to do in the lab, but are challenged to make ourselves useful. And I talked about three domains: climate change, trauma triage, and what was the third? Uh, it was all of 3 days ago. And
Mm.
anyways, oh, well, oh yeah, and pandemic disease. Okay. And and then so I talked about some of the research that we've done together with other people, and then made the case that I think the academic world, for there to be more of this kind of work, which I think would be good for society and rewarding for psychologists, the psychology academic world needs to change its incentive systems to reward people for the kind of slow work that this takes. And I made a pitch for a book that I wrote about this called Bounded Disciplines and Unbounded Problems, that were from the Clarendon Lectures in Management at Oxford a couple of years ago.
And how do you think, how successful are we in collaborating with policymakers and in convincing them and with sharing knowledge?
I mean, I find that they're really eager to find somebody in psychology who can work their problems. Most of the people who work in psychology tend to work in decision making, tend to work in business schools, so they tend not to work on public sector problems, but on private sector problems, or they also make big contributions. I think that these decision making problems and understanding the other people and problems, that's the day-to-day life of policymakers, and it's often very confusing, very frustrating for them that they do things that seem to be in the public interest, and often the public doesn't like what they do. Sometimes the public doesn't like them. And in psychology, we have you have a lot of potential hypotheses about what might be happening. I think we're most useful when we don't try to sell our particular theories, the things that we're most interested in, but often you'll be the only psychologist, academic psychologist they talk to. So, I'm a cognitive psychologist, but if I think research in emotion or social psychology is more important, it's my duty to talk about that, not my own research.
That's very interesting. So you're kind of positive about the possibilities of collaboration with policymakers.
I am. They're eager for it, but it takes one needs to build a relationship that you need to understand their world. They need to know that you're working their problem, not using them as a venue for testing your theories. And they want to know that this is a continuing relationship, so that if you give them advice and it doesn't work out, they know they to know where to find you. You're going to help them to figure out what happens, and stand up for the work. So that requires a lot of, I think, often very interesting, personal time, but that's time that doesn't produce papers in the short run. So if you're in the business of beefing up your resume, or you have to write grants to bring in funds from a traditional disciplinary funding organization, then it's objectively hard to make that commitment, however satisfying it might be. And however good it might be for our profession, that more people knew us and found us helpful.
So you say basically it's easier for those who already have tenure and established career to do such collaborations.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I didn't have my first. Well, actually, I talk in. I my first academic job was in Universitat Negev before it became the University of Negev before it became Ben Gurion University while I was a graduate student. But after that, I was on soft money in Eugene at Decision Research in Eugene, Oregon, with Paul Slovic and Sarah Lichtenstein, and we could do whatever we wanted if we could get somebody to pay for it. And sometimes they didn't, and we were on unemployment. But we continued to publish. So my first academic and in my first academic job was as a tenured full professor at Carnegie Mellon University. So
That's
uh,
not bad place to be.
no, 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 no. We were really. I was. It was an irregular career path. So my main department here is the Department of Engineering and Public Policy, and it has, I think, a terrific model that ideally everybody in the department has a joint appointment, a 50-50 appointment. It turns out to be a 75-75 appointment, in which for one half of it, you publish in the peer-reviewed literature of your discipline, and the other half of it, you work on problems together with other people in EPP or in government or in other. So you have to show that you're not doing applications, but you can't because you can't do basic research, but you also need to make yourself useful and test your theoretical ideas against this complicated reality and tell your story to people with very different backgrounds, which is part of what we do when we teach, but these are we talk to students, you tell them you determine the subject matter. You talk to policymakers, they determine the subject matter, and they're coming from different places. It also ideally would put you in a position of saying, oh, I've been out in the world, I discovered this new problem. Can we make it really deserves deep psychological inquiry. Can we work on this together within the necessary, like the necessarily bounded rationality of our profession? So when it works, the science advances and the science makes itself useful.
I think this is indeed a very interesting model. And tell you, please, can you elaborate on your biography before? Because I know that you have a very interesting biography. I think it will be interesting for our listeners as well.
Okay. Well, I'm flattered to be asked. It's always dangerous to ask people about their. I guess I grew up in Detroit. I went to the Detroit public schools, Werner Elementary and Mumford High, and I got a fantastic education. This was at a time when there were very few jobs available for women, so women who might be entrepreneurs today were teaching, and the men who were willing to work for women's wages were really dedicated for teaching. So I got a fantastic education, and then I went to Wayne State University in Detroit, which at that time it was all my family and I could afford. Which was at that time they had 35,000 students and 200 dormitory beds only for women nursing students. So it'll give you a feeling for
Wow.
it. I was a math major, and one of my teachers, I took a, I was, I worked the counter at a bowling alley as my college job. So you had to take other classes. I took some classes in psychology because it was a big department. It had early classes. And one of my teachers said, Sam needs somebody who knows math. And Sam was Samuel Comarita, who was doing what now would be, he was doing very early behavioral game theory. So I was his research assistant in a prisoner's dilemma study. And Sam was I had two fantastic undergraduate mentors. I had David Jonah in math, who kept giving me books. He gave me several books about how how people figured out the primitives of math. One by Neugebauer on how the Babylonians figured out what math was. One by was Gauss's discourses on arithmetic. Another on which are both really heavy going, and then Hardy's Mathematician's Apology, which you can read online, which is also great. And then Sam, who I only actually discovered in his obituary, was a Japanese American who had been interned during World War II in one of the camps that the U.S. government set up for Japanese people, interrupted his education, and when he was, I guess, freed, devoted his professional life to understanding how people get along or have conflict, which led him to behavioral game theory. He gave me Anatole Rappaport's Games, Fights, and Debates, and which led me to apply to the math psych program at University of Michigan, which is kind of the sort of like the equivalent of Niels Bohr's lab for decision in physics for decision making research. And my wife and I were planning to go to Israel and live in a kibbutz for the rest of our lives. And but I really wanted to meet Rappaport, and so I borrowed a friend's car and drove from Detroit to Ann Arbor. And everybody there I met with said, well, if you ever go back to school, which wasn't going to happen, I should look up Amos Tversky, they said was a genius. So a couple of years later, 2, 3 years later, my wife thought better of it. I still had Tversky's name. This is very early in his career as well. And as a miracle, he took me as a student. This was before he started working with Donnie Kahneman. And so I had I had a graduate education with 2 genius advisors. And then after that, Paul Slovic arranged for a postdoc for me at Decision Research in Eugene, Oregon. I worked with Paul and Sarah Lichtenstein, who are two absolutely fantastic experimentalists and really idealistic, wonderful people. So that was my irregular path to decision making research.
That is super interesting path, but can you please elaborate? You mentioned such famous names, so can you please elaborate on your work with them, with Amos Tversky, with Daniel, with Paul Slovic, and Sarah Lichtenstein?
Yeah.
It is very interesting.
So if I can make a pitch, I have another book coming out this fall, which is a intellectual autobiography that talks about some of it. It's called Decisions, and MIT Press is bringing it out in October. So
So it's
almost
called Decisions?
it's called Decisions, yeah.
Oh, wow. Like the name
MIT
of the
Press,
journal.
yeah, yeah.
Cool.
And the and it also talks about some of the stories that I talked about in my talk last week. So Amos was a very wise person, and one of the things that he told me early on, he said there are 2 models of advising. He said there's one where you do your advisor's work, you work in their lab, and you get a lot of attention and not all that much freedom, but and the second is you find your own problem and you have to keep your advisor's attention, but you have experience in formulating a problem. And he only liked to work with the latter. He said he wanted you to, he said both are perfectly legitimate. You can go from one to the other. And so he really, and Donnie Kahneman was the same. I think he did very important work in perception, and that more naturally lent itself to a lab, probably because you needed equipment that was dedicated, and also perception, even at that 50, 60 years ago, 50 years ago, was a better defined profession, whereas decision making was in a nascent state, and you had a better chance of coming up with a new something new. And I was a math major, so I had never done any science, much less any psychology when I got there. So I worked with Amos for a year, and also I took a great course with Amnon Rappaport, who recently passed away. And then I almost went to the States for a year. I ended up working with Donnie, who had only in retrospect realized that I didn't know, had no idea what science was, and guided me through to do, I think, a technically proficient and theoretically incompetent, I would say, master's thesis that I never published it. I looked at it recently. No, really, it had a great idea, but I really didn't know what I was doing. And then I started to do a PhD when the two of them were already working, and they had this amazing seminar where it was the hot ticket in Jerusalem at that time. All sort of people came in to listen to Amos and Donnie discuss their issues, and the graduate students would ask, who won that debate? And then sometimes, often whoever won that week, then the next week somebody else. It turned out they had been talking, and the other person came out on top, so to speak, or they had something completely new. And my task for the other student, as for the other, was to find something in that domain. So Maya Bar Hillel, who was my TA in Amos's Introduction to Mathematical Psychology, first course I took in graduate school, came up with a really imaginative work on base rate. Ruth by Marom came up with her own thing, and I ended up coming up with the work on hindsight bias.
Wow, that's super interesting. And you already answered my question kind of on how you came to the hindsight bias for which you're most known. But I will ask a different question. Perhaps, what is the most important lessons that you learned from these super smart people?
Well, I had, I guess as I said, I had two fantastic undergraduate advisors, who gave me a lot of attention, and then I had two doctoral and then two postdoctoral advisors. So I'd like to hope that I get, that I'm as good advisor to my students as I can. And through the students that I've had, I've realized that that everybody is different. Every student is different, and just as I was at that time, they're becoming a person at the same time that they're becoming a scientist. So I feel like it's important to provide moral support, but professional moral support, not to be, you're not helping your students if you try to be their counselor, because you don't have those skills, and it's really, if they need that support from someplace else. I personally have the honor of being the ombudsperson in engineering and public policy for the graduate students. So I have no official role. I never tell anybody anything that I've done, but I do report to the faculty, to give the gist of what's going on with the students once a year. And my primary advice is to schedule a weekly meeting with your graduate students that they can cancel if they don't feel ready. And I think the most common problem, that students have, the root cause, is that the fact that their advisor says, "I'm there whenever you need me," and they say that in all candor, but students don't actually know when they need their advisor, and they often hesitate. They know how busy their advisor is, so they hesitate to ask, and then maybe it takes a while to get into the schedule. So that would be, I think, just providing, trying to be as good an advisor, to be as sympathetic to just how difficult it is to learn something that you don't understand. In other words, they would be on this side of the desk if they knew what was happening. I've found with many students that there just seems to be there's some kind of a gap. There's a couple of months when nothing, even longer sometimes, when nothing seems to be happening. And it's sort of tempting can be tempting as an advisor to try to push. And I've learned that that these things go at their own pace, that there's some higher order mental structure, that's going on. Sometimes things are going on in the students' lives that you don't know about. So I try always to trust the students that they will be there. And it can be an error of omission. That is, people, some people need a push, but I'd rather err on the other side.
That's a great advice. I will try to implement it myself with my own students. Uh, Thank you. And going back for a second to the hindsight bias, that you discovered it. Did you, or from the first place, knew that you come on something very big, or at the beginning you thought, "Oh, I just found something." How was it?
Well, so well, if you could think of, what did the field look like, a long time ago, it was the Tversky kind of research program. The first program is heuristics and biases, and the heuristics are very hard to define. They're rules of thumb. They're not very well operationalized, and they're hard to operationalize. But the biases are easier to understand. Part of the reason why there's been such a proliferation of biases, because you can, not hard to find things that don't look right and then try to and write about them. And so I was really interested in history, how people tell history, how history is written. It's part of what got Andy, my wife, and I to the kibbutz. And I thought, well, if you read historiography, which is the I guess the methodology of history, there's a lot on hindsight bias, sometimes by that name, sometimes by other names, and what you can do to avoid it. And it seemed like, well, it'd be interesting to find a way to make science out of that. And so what I was able to do with the support of Dani and Amos, and a lot of support from Ruth Beit Maron, with whom I wrote a couple of the original papers, we were able to come up with like 4 different ways of measuring hindsight bias. And and I think, with their help, the methods stood up pretty well. I would say, for me, in retrospect, the I don't know, the seeming valley of depth in my professional development was, at some point, Dondi asked me. I was working with most at that time. I think Amos was in the States. The uh, Said, "Well, come up with a research program. What would a research program look like here?" And I sketched what I later realized was a research program for counterfactual judgments of all sorts. And I would still be working on it had I taken that on as my dissertation. And I think, and Donnie, in his wisdom, said, well, let's take which piece of this most interests you? And it was the counterfactual judgments associated with hindsight bias. And anyway, so I wrote, that's how I settled on that particular piece. And then, a little sad I didn't do the other things. Then other people have done them, and they get total credit for it. Or something, you have an idea, doesn't mean you've done the research. So I'm glad people have pursued those somewhat analogous issues.
That is super interesting. I'm sorry, I have a totally unscientific question, but I cannot help myself because you mentioned the kibbutz a few times. So I think it's historically very interesting. How was the life in the kibbutz in those days? I assume you were a very idealistic person because I assume the life was not easy at all. But I think it's might be interesting to hear from your personal
Oh, so,
perspective.
so for those who know the history, this was, I think we got it. So we were in a youth movement that encouraged people to go to kibbutz, and had a lot of very serious discussions of, and read a lot of history and so on. And at that time, the kibbutz was still pretty close to its original highly communal, very idealistic stage. I would say the next decade was really hard for economic and other reasons. Andy and I both came from quite poor families, so the fact that it was rugged, we didn't have our own toilet own toilet washroom for the first couple of years. Didn't
Wow.
particularly bothered us. I think what was and actually, it worked coincidentally worked out better for me than for Andy because of that the kibbutz had, and I think still has an active research unit, and I was somewhat seconded to that. There was probably a path for me where I could have gotten out of the kibbutz with some regularity and do research, done some research, might even have ended up with a PhD at some point, but there weren't that many options, and it was the two kibbutzim we were on were pretty isolated, and I would say gender roles were more segregated in the day to day than you would actually, and you also were, as we came to realize, we're making a commitment to the English to a human landscape would be a translation of the Hebrew perspective. Did you want to live with these people for the rest of your life? And some of them came with you, and the answer was yes. And we're still in touch with some of those people. Some still on the kibbutz, and some not. But there were other people who had, whose fate was in your hands, and you held their fate in your hands, and it was too constraining. So for social reasons more than material ones.
Very interesting. Did you knew Hebrew?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I like most, you know, I so growing up in Detroit, there weren't actually now most synagogues have their own Jewish or Hebrew school, but at that point in Detroit there was a United Hebrew school for that served everybody other than the Orthodox who had their own schools. So I learned to read and write Hebrew uh, for my bar mitzvah. So I had that, and we got to Israel. As maybe they still do now, sent everybody. They had an ulpan where you spent 4 hours working and 4 hours studying Hebrew. And I found that I really didn't like the Hebrew classes. They weren't really slow. The textbook at that time, which was 1,000 words, was designed for people who for they're all people coming from all over the world. So as my interpretation was designed for people, many of whom were not literate in any language. And I'd learned Russian, I learned German
Oh, wow.
German in high school, Russian in college because I was a math major, and I won a battle with the kibbutz to study by myself.
You are talented and fast learner. Impressive to learn so many
I don't know. You
languages.
spend 4 hours a day, memorizing. And Hebrew's a really logical language. There are a lot of rules, but you can, if you learn all, there's what is it, 293 declensions classes. So I could memorize 293 classes of verbs. So
Nice. Okay, going back to the science questions. What is, in your opinion, the most pressing issue nowadays in social science?
uh, I, I think it's to make ourselves useful. I think
Mm.
that again, the pitch in this in or the thesis in my book, this bounded disciplines and unbounded problems, is that there's absolutely no substitute for the rigorous training that we all get in undergraduate and graduate school. Psychology research looks and understanding people looks a whole lot easier than it is, but doing multiple drafts of surveys, having people beat you up in the review process on your papers, listening to other students solve problem, we have an ability to interpret social situations and think about and evaluate interventions that other people don't have. But it's not much social use is within the discipline, and we need these opportunities to work with other people who will benefit from this knowledge of the discipline as well as our particular expertise. And I think that that's also, there's well, it's particularly acute in this country right now, but there's a general crisis of confidence in experts and expertise. And I think being able to demonstrate that we're making ourselves more relevant, have more person-to-person contacts with people who will say, "Well, I know a psychologist," and and then will tell their friends that they know psychologists, and they told me these interesting things, and they're helping me to do that. So I think, I think reshaping the profession in a way that honors the value, both the social value and the intellectual value in applications, is, I think, the big challenge facing us.
And what do you think, a tough question, in the upcoming years with the proliferation of the AI and machine learning, will we still be useful? Or even in other words, if it will it be a bigger challenge for us, or perhaps this is an opportunity? What is your opinion?
I think actually with AI, I think we're in a unique position to create that bridge, a part of the bridge between the technology. And computer science isn't really a science; it's more of a very sophisticated kind of engineering. But to create a bridge between the technology and society, in its way, AI is a kind of cognitive theory or a form of cognition. So I think we have some insights there that we would get in collaborating with people. When I talk to people in AI, or we have some of that discussions here. We ask questions that hadn't occurred to them. There is some adoption. I just downloaded a paper this morning on the calibration of confidence in large language models. So we did work, Sarah Lichtenstein and Larry Phillips did work a long time ago on the calibration of sort of pulling together the work on the calibration of probabilities. People like David Badescu and Tom Walston and others have done lots since then. But they were basically taking a calibration model approach from psychology to be able to calibrate the value of models. Or I've had a couple of graduate students, actually both were sent by the Army as part of a program that gives them 3 years to do a PhD, who worked applied signal detection theory to dealing with AI. One with an AI, looked at an AI advisor, and another looking at people's ability to detect social bots in what was Twitter at the time. So I think we're in a unique, particularly people in decision science who have both the analytical and the behavioral. I think if we can find people to talk to us, then I think we could do a lot in explaining the technology and maybe advancing it, seeing what it can do and what it can't do.
That's an optimistic view. I'm happy to adopt it. Uh, Tell me, please, maybe you partially already answered this question, but what is your vision for our community, let's say 10 years from now or so?
Well, I would like to see more work like that done in engineering and public policy, and other programs that have the similar, that expect, a thinner resume of basic research papers and more jointly authored papers with people in application areas, and accept that there'll be things that are very valuable that don't get any publications. I have I have I've been on many committees of our National Academy of Sciences. About 15 years ago, I chaired one commissioned by the U.S. Director of National Intelligence. This is the integrating agency that was created from the 9/11 commission report, and they wanted a report on how to bring decision science um, into intelligence analysis. So we wrote a consensus report and then a volume of readings where everybody in the committee had a chapter explaining, in a dedicated way, this is what operations research is, what decision analysis, the psychology of decision making, intergroup relations, because they do collaborative work. So they have these two reports. Each of them has, from the two sites that I followed, a total of 25,000 downloads. Doesn't mean 25,000 reads, of course. And I think one academic citation.
Wow.
And I
Wow.
mean, particularly intelligent, these are people who don't cite, and but a lot of so we need different ways of rewarding you know good work that's done outside of the usual evaluation scheme, and it's we have some imperfect ways of evaluating published research. We need some maybe we need more imperfect ways of evaluating applied research.
I agree. And I cannot help myself, but I have to ask a question, unrelated kind of question. What is your secret? I mean, it seems that you're completing so many different things, so many committees, so many books. You are a prolific researcher, grad students. So, what is your secret to be so efficient
Uh,
and accomplished?
well, I really love the work. I think, yeah, just that's my revealed preference. And I find that people bring interesting problems. You get to learn about other worlds, and you know, you can imagine that you're being useful because you're closer to the actual problems, and I've been very fortunate to find I was at the University of the Negev at a time that the behavioral science department was forming, and so that was an interdisciplinary department. And then I actually taught in the School of Social Work as well for a couple of years in Jerusalem. And then I was at Decision Research, where it was part of a collaborative. The original funding was collaborative, and not long after we got there, Paul Slovic started getting calls from particularly people in the nuclear industry saying, we have this lovely technology. Some people don't like the technology. Some people don't like us. Can you help? And Paul was gracious enough to invite me to that, and we started this work on the human side of risk analysis, just how much do the experts know, and then why do people object, and then partly because the field was very small at that time, and then it grew initially in business schools, so there weren't a lot of people interested in and with the freedom to work on public sector problems. So Paul and I, and to some extent Sarah, became go-to people, and then once people start giving out your name, other people take your name. So I've been really grateful, and to have all these things that to work on.
Very interesting. You said you really like your work, which is a blessing. And how do you manage to find a work-life balance, if at all? Like, how many hours are you working, if I'm allowed to ask?
Uh, well, I would say, I, I don't know. I don't think I've count. I mean, I have a wonderful wife. We've been together since we met at summer camp when we were 15 and 16. So, and I have three wonderful kids, Maya, Ilya, and Noam. And when they were in the house, two of them, Maya and Noam, are in Pittsburgh now, and Ilya's in Los Angeles. So I've tried to be a good father and a good partner, and to put that above other things. I currently don't have any hobbies. For a long time, I used to play. I have very slow. I like sports, but I have very slow reflexes. So I found two sports that when we lived in Eugene, I played handball, which I with a hard ball. It's an unusual sport, and actually was in Jerusalem. I learned squash from a South African friend, and actually I taught Amos Tversky how to play squash. So I'm pride myself on being one of the few people who ever taught Amos anything, and like everything else, he got really good, really fast. So I pretty much, I like to do the work, which is a way of interacting with people or words, and with my family. So
That's very interesting. A few suggestions for sport. You can play chess or poker. Does not require the being too fast, usually.
there's a local kids soccer league called Dynamo, set up by a wonderful psychologist named Sam Cho, and in which they keep the tone down by not allowing the fans to use any kid's names, and the teams all have Greek letter names. So so if you're writing like Go Iota is a little, you can't get too inflamed. So I volunteered to be a referee, and turned out I had to be FIFA certified. And and having never played the game, I actually took the course with the head of our physics department. Both of us thought that we had flunked the exam, but somehow they waved us through. And there's a wonderful, still for many years since the 1960s, there's been the European, now run by the European Association for Decision Making. There's been a meeting, SPUDM, Subjective Probability, Utility, and Decision Making, that during the Cold War, people from the West paid fees to enable people from the East who had no hard currency to come. It was a really wonderful track to diplomacy. And in 1989, Oleg Larachev, who had created a decision science like unit at the All Union Institute of System Studies, managed to get the have a spudum there with the stipulation that Israelis could come. So Amos and Maya and some other people were there. So this is 1989, so still pretty cold, but they managed to do this here. And I was once talking about this with some of our Russian or probably mostly Russian or Soviet colleagues, and I mentioned that I was a FIFA certified referee, and they were aghast. It just seemed chess, as you say, that's a game for an academic, but not not so. Anyways,
That's interesting, but I think one of the advantages of being in academia is that you can do whatever you want, as you mentioned before. So you can be in the FIFA if you like. And tell me, please, if not academia, what do you think you would do in life?
I think, I mean, since I did have these strong applied, public interests, which has got us to the kibbutz, and have been, fairly involved in political things most of my life. I think, well, I had a commitment I got out of graduate school. If we couldn't find a way to make the work that we're doing useful in a social sense, I would find something else. And I don't know what that something else was. We didn't really have Andy and I, we had kids then, didn't have a financial safety net. So it might well have been determined where I could have made a living.
Good answer. And you already kind of mentioned it, but how do you find research questions to work on? Or perhaps not research questions, but questions in generally, because you mentioned your collaborations with the policymakers a lot. Or perhaps they find you.
Well, so these So early in my career, I was a conventional psychologist. I, did the hindsight bias, which is an extension of the heuristics and biases work. When I started working with Paul and Sarah, we did work on confidence assessment, and as I mentioned, coincidentally, we started getting these requests for people initially in the nuclear power industry on why people rejected them, and we looked at their risk analyses and we just didn't believe them. We didn't think that they were first of all, we thought they were cognitive constructions that ignored a lot of the risks, particularly the risks having to do with human factors. They were often without confidence assessment, confidence intervals. They didn't really treat uncertainty. So there were some natural questions about the quality of the judgment that went into the expert work, which had a natural extension into work that was going on. And then we started looking at the measures of risk that they had, and they were really naive measures. They were measures of direct fatalities, from estimated direct fatalities, and that's not all that people worry about. It doesn't care. It doesn't deal with the psychological impact of worrying about things, which has physiological consequences and is a quality of life thing. It doesn't deal with the equity issues of pushing a plant or a hazard waste disposal site in some or solar array in somebody's backyard. Those are part of the consequences. And so these were really ethical issues that we thought. So we've had questions about the two kinds of subjectivity. How good was the expert judgment, and where were they imposing a particular value set on it? And both of those are places where decision-making research, psychology more generally, knows where to go, go to next. And I would get probably that framing of looking at the two kinds of subjectivity as what we have taken to new problems. And there's, every problem has something, there are new things, the kinds of uncertainty are different. Over the year, the course, you realize that if you're communicating with people, the process is as important as the product, as the content. So we're cognitive, so we know the content. But if you don't talk to people, you talk to people later rather than sooner, then they wonder why you're not talking to them. You leave a vacuum that other people can fill with misinformation or disinformation. And I tend to think that if you're worried about misinformation, you've already messed up. And we should worry more about proactive communication of information, making certain that people hear us and so on, so we have fewer holes to dig ourselves out of. So, and each of these, knowing how psychologists frame these issues and being able to reach out to somebody and say, I know this is a signal detection theory issue. How can we do it? So we did this project I mentioned in the talk on signal detection theory and trauma triage. And I had at that time a postdoc named Corinne Ferris, who came from the math psych program at Indiana. And it was actually a clinical mathematical psychologist. I think she and Robin Dawes might have been maybe one of the few people in that space, and she helped us to do a very sophisticated adapt signal detection theory to these unique cases of trauma triage. So I
That's
always
very
assume that
interesting.
there's something to be learned, and if you don't look, I think in principle, I believe if you're not looking for something new, then you're just consulting.
Yes, in a kind of, yeah, yeah, which can be very beneficial, at least financially, if you're a good consultant.
Yeah, nothing wrong with consulting, but if we have a position in a university, you should be, trying to extend the science. So.
Totally agree. And talking about science, what is, in your opinion, the most impressive finding from the last, say, 10 years, but 5 years, whatever?
Um, I tend to think it's a mistake to be impressed by findings. You know,
Okay.
any interesting problem is so complicated that it would be the very rare finding that would explain more than some small percent of the variance. I think we need to be passionate about our own findings. We need to convey that passion to our students and our colleagues. We need to recognize that somehow often the tastes in academia won't find our findings interesting, but it's just a matter of taste, not a matter of inherent value. So I think the discipline that enables us to produce findings, that's impressive. But the findings themselves, they come and go.
Very interesting perspective. And tell me, please, you already made some advice for the advisors. What is your advice for the young scholars, so say the advisees?
So I say when prospective candidates come in to visit or call, or our students are looking for other programs, I say, ask other students in the program, who are in the program. If you can find them, people who have finished the program or left the program, what it's really like to be there. And I think that almost all faculty try really hard to do a good job with their students, but but not each of us has has the same level of ability. Some of us are going through, crises that we can't provide as much attention as they want. Some of us are good for the kind of students who really want to work in a lab, and some of us are better for students who like to find their own problems. So find out, talk to other students who can help you decide whether a potential advisor, which is, or advisors are right for you as best you can, best you can tell. Another thing, I think this would be, I mean, it's impossible, it's you can't really know what academic life is until you get into it. There's this really odd turn of mind that we have of trying to get to the bottom of things and learning to block out all sorts of other issues that might, that are outside the bounds of our discipline. And until you've tried it, you might not know if you like it. So you could decide it's not, it shouldn't be a sign of failure if you decide, I want the training, but I don't want the profession. I mean, I want to be that person who has this kind of rigorous perspective, but I don't want to be publishing papers, or decide I don't want to spend 4 years doing this. I'm going to take a master's and do something else, and I'll have acquired a lot of the skills along the way, and I'll respect that people who don't. So I think for many years I ran an undergraduate major in decision science that Jen Lerner and I created, and so nobody comes. Well, actually, now they may do, but 20 years ago or 25 years ago, nobody went to college to study decision making. So most of the students who came through would say were in something else, sometimes another social science, sometimes psychology. I remember once an oboe player who was totally frustrated with cutting reeds and having to recut them when the humidity changed. So I would often talk to students that I had an opportunity, and I hope I was giving them good advice. I thought it was really good to get into a major as soon as possible as an undergraduate. So you became part of the cohort. You found out how those people thought. You weren't as isolated, but to treat it just as a hypothesis. And if it doesn't work, then you'll do something else, and it will have been a positive experience. I think kind of the same thing about academia. We wouldn't be where we are if we weren't really passionate about publishing the papers. But there's no reason why that should be right for everybody.
So can I summarize your advice as the first to find a good matching, or try to find perhaps a good matching? Sounds like a good advice to marriage as well, as someone who is married for very many years. And
Takes a certain amount of luck. So
definitely, I think luck is generally very important in life. And the second advice is not to fall into the sunk cost effect,
yeah, yeah.
in a sense.
Yeah, or the social norms, of graduate school, that there are people, I think we have very talented undergraduates here who at Carnegie Mellon, like you have, the people who've driven themselves really hard. And, for many of them, changing course feels like failure. And then for people who come to graduate school, sometimes they're even more selective, work even harder to get into it, and so it's there's so I guess that's in part sunk cost, but I think there's something else. So there's the kind of the social norms, which I guess
Mhm.
maybe part of the social sunk cost effect is the social norms that make it feel like failure. So you're not just internalizing the loss, but you're thinking that other people are thinking badly of you.
But by the way, if we discuss about social norms, what people think about you, do you agree? My personal opinion is that we have to be more humble in the sense that we think other people think about us, but actually, in my opinion, other people just simply don't care. Like they're interested in their own problems and don't think much about us, not because they are bad people, just because they're very busy with their own problems.
Yes, I think that's good. I think somebody called that the spotlight effect. Right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think you're right. Yeah. Agree. Okay, Baruch, we are coming to our last question, I think. And you already mentioned your two books, which is Bounded Disciplines and Unbounded Problems, if I'm correct, right? And the second
Yep,
one is Decisions, which you recommended us to read. Is there
absolutely,
any other
absolutely.
book which you would recommend us to read, or we will stop with these two?
Well, so the one that Sam Kelmarita gave me by Anatole Rappaport, and I never can remember it's Fights, Games, and Debates, or Games, Fights, and Debates. Rappaport, worth looking him up on online. It's really a polymath and Renaissance individual. So that's really what got me into the field. It's thinking very deeply about different kinds of decision-making problems, some of which, we can, some fraction of them, each of us can make some science. I just reread H. Hardy's Mathematician's Apology, which you can find online. You can read it in an evening. It's kind of a good. It's pretty idiosyncratic, and anyways, I recommend. I won't say anything more about that. I recommend that people read it. So those were two, formative books early in my career. And actually, I find maybe I shouldn't admit it while I'm being recorded. I don't read a lot of books. I like to hear. I read a lot, but I like to hear hear what somebody's ideas are, and then think about them in terms of what I care about.
I think nowadays it's easier than, let's say, 30 years ago, thanks to the internet. It's easier to hear many ideas.
That's right.
Maybe
Yeah. But I want to hear it in their voice. I don't want to hear the AI summary. And that's actually, my advice to the students is that I have them all write papers from an outline, from a topic to an outline to a paper. I give them detailed comments. I have them write little essays, and I try to tell them, you're just cheating yourself if if you rely on AI, summary. This is an opportunity to find your own voice. So, and I'm, do the best I can to help them. And I think so. I want to hear different people's authorial voices. Sometimes the way they say it is more important than what exactly they say.
Baruch, I cannot thank you enough. This was a fascinating talking with you. It was a great pleasure. We learned so many new things. Thank you so, so much for your time. This
Well,
was
thanks for
very
asking me,
interesting.
and I'm honored to be asked, and I enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you.